Good afternoon, and thanks to all of you for coming. We at the Washington Papers are in the business of preserving and transcribing and publishing all of Washington's letters. So you can imagine our surprise a number of years ago when we received a letter from George Washington, written to us. And he was alive and well and living where else but in Cincinnati. Actually, it was a gentleman who claimed to be the reincarnation of George Washington, who was eager and willing to offer us his help in understanding the great man's life. Well, sometime after that, a group of very well-dressed individuals came into our office, and our then editor-in-chief, Bill Abbott, met with them, and they said they had some materials and information pertaining to George Washington that they'd be delighted to share with us and to help us out. So they seemed to be very respectable, so he invited them in and sat down, and they placed themselves near the only exit to his office, so he couldn't get out without passing them. And at that time, they revealed that they were spiritualists who had gotten in touch with Washington's spirit and were in daily conversation and willing to share information, again, about how Washington lived and who he was, so on and so forth. So he had to sit there and listen to them for a while before they finally left. And a short time after that, I received an email in my inbox, which was from a tabloid reporter in England. And he revealed that a number of volumes of Washington's diaries, which had been thought lost, had been discovered in a Scottish castle. And these diaries were particularly fascinating because they revealed what Washington had done at Valley Forge and how he had really been able to get through that terrible winter encampment. Well, he had received aid from a strange and unknown source that there was a mysterious tribe of Indians living in the forests. And Washington thought they looked kind of greenish, so he called them the Greenskins. And they lived in a big aluminum teepee out in the woods. Well, this reporter concluded with good reason that space aliens had helped Washington to win the Revolutionary War. Thus, my inspiration for this book. It truly is amazing working at the Washington Papers on the one hand, and I've been there for 15 years now, and working with Washington's letters and getting to know how he lived, how he breathed day to day, what his everyday concerns were, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the constant barrage of queries and questions and information volunteered to us by the general public. And a lot of it is really very useful. There are people who are actually still discovering Washington letters in their attics. There are people who have local information, who understand their local history, say from Alexandria or from Fredericksburg or from other areas where they really have information that can be very valuable to us. But on the other hand, there are people who ask us questions like, one person asked me, is it really true that Washington died in Russia on an engineering expedition? Or we get a lot of queries from the press and from others asking about, did Washington really say this? Is it really true that Washington said this? And there are so many Washington quotations floating around now, and so many Washington legends floating around now, especially on the internet, that it really intrigued me. Where is all this stuff coming from? What about all these statements that Washington supposedly said about politics, about religion, about morality, about everything you can imagine? What about these stories that he did or didn't do that thing? What about, for example, the story that's floating around now that he smoked marijuana, that he grew it at Mount Vernon and he liked to smoke it for relaxation? Where is this coming from? So it intrigued me. And, of course, we all know the stories of Parson Weems. We all know the cherry tree story. And now here are these modern stories. And how do we create a link? What does it mean about us and our relationship with George Washington. Washington died on December 14th, 1799. And to us it seems like, and this is a Victorian rendition, a mid-19th century rendition of it, it seems like a very peaceful scene, actually. There's a gentle sadness about it. It seems like he died peacefully at Mount Vernon, and Americans shed a few collective tears. The great man has passed, and we're now going to move on and live by his example. Actually, it was for most Americans a wrenching emotional moment. It was an event that cast us into a state of anguish. We were mortified. We were terrified. What's going to happen now? The great man has passed away. We're on the cusp of a new century into the 1800s. We are at war. A lot of people don't realize that when Washington died, he was in active military service as the commander in the field of our armed forces, when we were expecting at any moment we might be invaded by France. It was a period called the Quasi-War, when it was kind of an undeclared war between the United States and France, and there was this fear that the French were going to invade to impose their will. And remember, this was really only a short time after the Revolutionary War, less than 20 years. Most Americans could remember what war was like, and here it might come again. Washington had been put by President John Adams in charge of the Army, and Washington left a lot of the day-to-day business in Alexander Hamilton's care, but still, he's the man. At every moment, at every crisis in our history, we had turned to George Washington. So when he died, this wave of emotion swept across the country as news began to spread very slowly across the country, and Americans learned that Washington was gone. There was this outpouring of grief and public memorials and eulogies remembering Washington and remembering who he was and thinking about his example to us. And there was this collective need somehow to bring Washington back. There was this yearning that somehow we have to fill this gulf, this hole that his passing has left for our nation. The space is open. Who do we put into this space? We need to bring Washington back. So the wish created, in many ways, the return of George Washington. And thus, our friend, Parson Weems. He wasn't really a parson. His name was Mason Locke Weems. He had known George Washington briefly in the 1780s. He had been a visitor at Mount Vernon. He had married into a branch of the family. And he was one of the many people who walked through in Mount Vernon and drove George and Martha crazy when they were still alive because there were so many visitors who were coming. And so he was one of them. So right after George Washington dies, Mason Locke Weems writes to his publisher named Matthew Carey in Philadelphia. And he says, Washington has just died. Millions of people are gaping to read something about him. We can make a lot of money. That was what he immediately saw. And Parson Weems, I'll keep calling him Parson Weems just to be nice to him. Parson Weems saw the dollar bill in Washington long before Washington was on the dollar bill. I'm glad you like that. I made that up myself. I think that's cute. But he did. He was in this for money. He was in it to make gobs of money. But he also, to give him credit, he wanted to bring Washington to everyday Americans. Right after Washington died, there were a number of biographies of Washington that were published. The best-known one was by John Marshall, which you can still get now. Is available. But it was a huge, ponderous biography. John Adams compared it to a mausoleum. And it's very dull, it's very hard to get through, it's very long, and it created a Washington who is very distant, who is that man of marble, that statue